The following is intended only for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised.
The Dayton Strangler was an unidentified early 20th century serial killer who preyed on women, bludgeoning them, strangling them into unconsciousness, sexually assaulting them, and leaving them for dead. The Dayton Strangler was responsible for the murders of 5 females and 1 male in Dayton, Ohio from 1900 to 1909. Many people in the community referred to the would-be murderer, the Strangler of Death Lane, Man Gorilla of Death Lane, Jack the Strangler, and most notably, the Dayton Strangler. 11-year-old Adah Lance, 19-year-old Dona Gilman, 18-year-old Anna Markowitz, 11-year-old Abraham Cowan, 15-year-old Mary Forschner, and 18-year-old Elizabeth Fulhart were all murdered in a span of 9 years at the hands of the Dayton Strangler. Police and investigators linked the crimes to the same person based off on the similarity of their deaths and the proximity of each murder location. The murderer in question that haunted Dayton, Ohio would go on to never have a real name but forever be known as the Dayton Strangler. Although a multitude of suspects were arrested, including one who was wrongfully convicted, the murders remain officially unsolved to this day. It's been 100+ years since the Dayton Strangler terrorized this southwest Ohio town. Police, investigators, spectators, the victims' families, friends, and all people alive during these murders are no longer living today, and sadly justice was never found. May the victims and their families forever rest in peace. Please join us and hear these encounters. Let's piece together these unsolved murders and the tragic fate of these 6 victims. Let's hear their story, and may they never be forgotten. The Dayton Strangler, still at large. Mid-October 1900, Charles and Carrie Lance were having a party at their home at 48 Leroy Street in Dayton to celebrate their birthday anniversaries. The family invited a lot of people over. The party starts at 8 p.m., and the adults are drinking and having a good time playing cards. The daughter of a prominent local carpenter, 11-year-old Adah Lance, decides to sneak out into the backyard unnoticed during the party. The adults don't notice until 10 p.m. that little Adah is missing, and the party frantically search for her for an hour and a half. A friend of Carrie and Charles suggested checking the outhouse for their daughter. At 11:30 p.m., Adah Lance was found stuffed down the hole of an outhouse in her parents' backyard on October 14, 1900. She had been badly mutilated and bruised, with a scar from a blunt weapon across her face believed to be from a cane, and she had been assaulted with her clothes torn to shreds. Adah was strangled and her neck was broken. She was placed head first into the 15-inch hole of the outhouse. Adah was alive when placed into the hole and had suffocated on the dirt and substances. Investigators believe the attacker hid behind the fence of the abandoned house next door, and as Adah steps outside to go use the outhouse, the attacker grabs Adah by the throat and mouth, dragging her to the ground and clubbing her. Her attacker then drags her over to the neighbor's yard. Investigators find pieces of Adah's clothing on the rose bushes of the neighbor's yard. She is sexually assaulted and then dragged back over to the outhouse. Investigators believe the ordeal happened in under 15 minutes. Within a few days after Adah's murder, several arrests occurred. A man named E.L. Fox was arrested for Adah's murder but released. Also arrested and released was a known criminal named David Penzel. William Mindel, Dave's cohort, was detained but also released. The police arrest 56-year-old Nathan A. Emmons on suspicions, but he stoutly maintained his innocence. Nathan A. Emmons was an elderly crippled man that only had one leg and used a cane and had been renting a shed in the neighbor's yard. Nathan was detained but ultimately released. An older man from Jamestown, Ohio, was arrested and then released when he had an alibi. Over the year of Adah's murder, there were 3 sexual assaults plus 1 attempted assault in the grandstands during a circus. 18-year-old Harrison Harry Blessing tried pulling the girl through the bleacher seats but was stopped by bystanders. No charges were pressed, and shortly after, Blessing broke into a woman's room while she was sleeping and assaulted her. He was charged, fined, and let go. Harrison Harry Blessing lived 12 blocks from Adah Lance. Police arrested Blessing on August 26, 1901 after confessing to several people that he was the killer. Blessing was released because he denied those claims to police and investigators didn't have enough evidence. Adah's case goes cold and no one was ever officially convicted for her murder. 2024 marks the 124-year anniversary since little Adah Lance was murdered. The home and murder location of Adah Lance at 48 Leroy Street in Dayton, Ohio, has since been torn down and just a vacant lot remains. Adah Lance's final resting place is at Woodlands Cemetery in Arboretum in Dayton. The tragic crime created great excitement in the days, weeks, and months after Adah's murder in the surrounding neighborhood. After Adah's murder in 1900, the Dayton Strangler does not strike again for 6 years until 1906. It was 1 week until Thanksgiving. Rain had persisted for several days and turned Dayton into a cool, soggy Ohio. More on November 22, 1906. when a woman's body was discovered concealed in the weeds of a common on the west side of Groveland Avenue near Grandview Avenue. The Dayton Herald made it front page news under the bold headline, "Girl Murdered. Body Hid in Weeds." The murdered woman was identified as 19-year-old Dona Gilman, an employee of National Cash Register Company. The crime scene and condition of the body were described in detail. The further the investigation is conducted, the deeper the mystery becomes. It is the supposition of the officers and physicians that if she had been killed on the ground, her arms would have been at her side, but as it is, the right arm pointed upward, the elbow resting on the ground, while the hand was crooked, as though she had been resisting her assailant. It is also the supposition that the body was left upon the spot where the murder was committed, and then carried, after the body had become stiff, to the place where it was discovered. The killer murdered her somewhere else, then dumped her where she was found, but because rigor mortis had set in, her body was found in an odd position. Her clothes were wet, and it is thought that she had been laying in the rain since Tuesday, November 20th. An umbrella borrowed from Miss Ethel Collins of Forest Avenue, who also worked at NCR. And the pair of gloves supposed to have been worn by the murdered girl were found on the ground near the body. The umbrella and gloves are perfectly dry. The officials admit that if the umbrella had been wet, it could have been dried by the wind, but if the gloves had dried, they would have been stiff. When found, the gloves were soft. This condition is a puzzle to the officers. 2 hat pins were found lying on the ground near the body. One was bent, indicating the possibility of the hat being torn from her head and later placed upon her head as it was found this morning. A surface examination of the physical crime scene told a story about how the attack happened. From the evidence furnished by the territory surrounding the scene of the crime, the assault must have taken place on the west side of Groveland Avenue, where the street gave evidence of a struggle which was continued into the commons, where the weeds were crushed and disturbed. Naturally, investigators wanted to piece together Dona's last movements. According to the Dayton Herald, the last that was seen of the murdered girl was at 5:40 Tuesday evening, November 20th, 1906. She rode home on a Went 5th streetcar with her cousin, Ruby Bond, of Grosvenor Avenue. Miss Bond got off at Grosvenor, leaving Miss Gilman on the car. The conductor of the car was a man named Tanzel, and efforts were made to interview him and see if anyone got off the train car with Dona, but it was of no use to investigators. The post-mortem examination confirmed the theory that the girl was choked to death. There was one immediate theory of note, though, right from the start of the murder investigation. The theory was advanced that the girl had been murdered by a jealous sweetheart, but this is believed to be incorrect. Miss Gilman had a young man friend who lived in Sharonville, Ohio. He was not in this city Tuesday night when the murder is supposed to have been committed. Fane Gilman, the sister of the murdered girl, Tuesday night called up the forewoman in the department at the NCR company where Dona Gilman was employed. The forewoman suggested that the young man in Cincinnati be questioned, thinking possibly that there might have been an elopement. Acting upon the suggestion of the forewoman, the sister of the murdered girl called up the young man in Sharonville and had no trouble in finding him. He said that he knew nothing of the whereabouts of the girl and had not seen her for several days. The name of the murdered girl's friend who lived in Sharonville, near Cincinnati, was Stanley Anderson. The police questioned Stanley Anderson, and he was able to provide an acceptable alibi. The murder of Dona Gilman would be an enduring mystery that occupied the press in Ohio for years because there were plenty of supposed suspects and developments that didn't amount to much. A local man the newspapers referred to as a halfwit, David Curtis, or Baby Dave as some would call him, was arrested, and he promptly confessed. It soon became clear he was an attention-seeking eccentric, and by December he'd been cleared. Public opinion was that the authorities had attempted to railroad him. On December 10, 1906, the day that Dona Gilman's body was exhumed, an arrest warrant was put out against her mother, Kate. However, due to her ailing health, she was kept under watch, while 2 of her other children, Collins and Fane, were arrested as accessories in their sister's murder. The siblings pleaded not guilty at their trial, with the 18-year-old Collins testifying against David Curtis, who he alleged had confessed to him as well. Upon hearing that there were arrest warrants for her children, Kate Gilman tried to commit suicide by jumping out a second-story window at the Miami Valley Hospital, but was restrained by the attending nurses. She was ordered to be examined by 2 reputable physicians, Drs. H.J. Guy and A.H. Iddings. And although she resisted, They declared that she was healthy enough to be transported to jail. At trial, a female coworker and friend of Dona revealed that the victim had been abused by her mother. For example, one time Dona was locked in a closet simply for wanting a new dress. On the night of the murder, the friend explained that the would-be victim was particularly afraid to go home. On December 22, 1906, the Gilman family members were released from jail on a $5,000 bond. Collins was the first to be released, greeted by a crowd of friends, while his mother was put in an ambulance and driven off to St. Elizabeth Hospital. In April 1907, the family appeared in court again, this time including another daughter, Bessie, who lived in Germantown. All of them were released on bond again a few days later, the mother and son for $2,500 and the two daughters for $1,000 each. Soon after, the family was cleared of the murder. On December 21st of that year, Kate Gilman passed away from edema, and 3 days later, her body was buried beside that of her murdered daughter. There were other arrests and suspects, too. In the century plus since the murder of Dona Gilman, most agree none of the suspects identified or arrested for her murder is the actual perpetrator. And we know that's the case, because the killing continued. Dona Gilman was last seen alive getting off a streetcar in Dayton, Ohio as she made her way home from work. She was walking alone along a common, which is a small wilderness-type area where a killer could conceal himself. She was apparently attacked from behind by a fiend who choked her, dragged her to a more secluded area, sexually assaulting her, and left her for dead. It was 2 blocks from the rail line. The Strangler was likely waiting in the darkness at the stop where Dona got off the car. The unidentified murderer of Dona Gilman, the Dayton Strangler, was a disorganized, impulsive killer who brashly attacked in public. A sexual deviant who sometimes dragged his victims to another location and had a penchant for going for the throat. It's been 118 years since Dona Gilman was viciously murdered not far from her home in the wooded area on the west end of Groveland Avenue near Grandview Avenue. No one was ever convicted for the murder of Dona, and her murder is still officially unsolved to this day. Dona Gilman is buried at Germantown Union Cemetery with her parents in Germantown, Ohio. It should be noted that Dona Gilman's body was found by her brother in the Common just blocks away from where Adah Lance had been murdered 6 years prior at the Lance home. The Gilman home was located next to the Common area and is still standing today. The next set of murders would take place at McCabe Park the next year, just walking distance from where Dona's body was found. "18-year-old pawnbroker's daughter Anna Markowitz from Covington, Kentucky, and her 11-year-old traveling salesman boyfriend Abraham Gordon, who went by the name Abe Cohan, were out walking on a lonely road near the National Soldiers' Home. It was August 4th, 1907. Anna's 16-year-old sister Bertha had come along to keep them company. From out of the darkness a man appeared. He swung a weapon sometimes described as a baton or a blackjack at Abe Cohen and struck him on the back of the head. Cohen turned to see who had attacked him, and the attacker pulled a gun and shot him twice in the abdomen. Bertha later told investigators, as Abe Cohen fell to the ground, the attacker lunged for the sisters, and Bertha's feet took over. She ran screaming from the scene to the soldiers' home to get help. When a posse returned, they found Cohen still alive, but barely. Anna was missing. They followed the trail left by a struggle which led them through the brush to Anna Markowitz's body. Anna's clothing had been nearly torn from the body. The arms were crowded down over the eyes as if to shut out a horrible picture. There was evidence of a fearful struggle and an assault. The girl was dead from strangulation. Cohen was rushed to the hospital, where although he was still alive, he was so dazed that any of his statements were considered incoherent. 2 days later, he succumbed to his injuries. This left Anna's younger sister Bertha Markowitz as the only eyewitness who had seen the strangler up close. Bertha described the assailant as perhaps 25 to 30 years old, tall, clean-shaven, and dressed in all dark clothing. The only clue left to the mystery was provided by Eliza Virus, a black housekeeper who was close to the crime scene. She claimed that at around 10 o'clock on Sunday night, she heard gunshots and a woman crying in reproach. Soon after, the voice said, "Harry. Harry. Oh, Harry." The mysterious Harry was never identified. Despite signs to the contrary, the authorities initially suspected highway robbery as the motive for the crime. As with the case of Dona Gilman, when robbery no longer seemed likely, investigators focused their attention on the victim's family. Anna Markowitz's siblings were held under suspicion for a time because Anna's brothers didn't like Abe dating their sister and gave him a hard time about it, even admitting to once following him to Lakeside Park, but they denied all involvement in the crime. The murders of Abe Cohen and Anna Markowitz happened near the same location where Dona Gilman's body was found, in the area of Dayton today known as McCabe Park. The Gilman home and the common where Dona had been found a year prior was just east of McCabe Park. Only a few hundred feet separated where Dona was found and Anna and Abe were murdered. Like every neighborhood, it has changed a lot since the highway came through, but there are a surprising number of landmarks still around. A stone's throw from McCabe Park is the Dayton VA, which is what would have been commonly referred to as a soldier's home back then. Is it a coincidence that the murders of Cohen, Markowitz, Gilman, and Lance had all taken place not far from a rail car line where the would-be murdered could have easily hopped on and off the train? The nature of the nearby rail line also brings to mind several other questions. It was a remote, solitary spur from the main line, known as the Home Avenue Spur, built primarily to serve the cemetery and National Soldiers' Home operation beginning all the way back in 1867. It was the railroad equivalent of a dead end. On October 10, 1907, a black man by the name of Leighton Marion, or known by the alias Leighton Hines, was arrested on suspicion of killing Anna Markowitz and Abe Cohen. And it was later alleged by Sheriff Bose that he had made a full confession. According to one witness, Frank Allen, on the night of the murders, he had seen Hines standing near the park's little bridge. He was greeted by Leighton and greeted back. Sometime later, he heard 4 shots, but ignored it and moved on. The following day, when he heard of the tragedy, he quickly identified Hines as the man he had seen in the park. Hines' attorney, Kumler, tried to make Allen budge in his identification, but failed. On the day of his trial, he confessed to never having a criminal record and to have been intimidated into falsely confessing the crime. Hines was adamant that the assisting prosecuting attorney Routson had abused him in the interview, and that Coroner Schuster and Sheriff Bose encouraged him to confess in order to be turned loose. Disregarding his statements, he was still convicted of the double murder, but was spared the death penalty when the murders continued on. Authorities later admitted that they had doubts about his conviction and later released him. Shortly following the double murder of Anna Markowitz and Abe Cohen, 2 of her brothers and her younger sister were detained on suspicion: Harry, Jacob, and Bertha. According to authorities, they disapproved of the young couple's relationship and wanted to get rid of both. Sheriff Bose even claimed that a canvas fingerstall found near the crime scene matched the imprint of Harry's thumb, which was coincidentally injured. A pair of handkerchiefs were also located near the crime scene. On August 8th, the day of Anna's burial, however, the Markowitz siblings were all released and attended the funeral, in which the local rabbi cursed the ground on which the young girl was murdered. Anyway, here we are again with a murder confession and an actual conviction this time, and yet the consensus seems to be they never got the right person. It's been 117 years since Anna and Abe were brutally murdered, and even with one conviction, the would-be murdered would go on to never be caught for both their murders. Anna Markowitz is buried at Beth Jacobs Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio. Abraham Gordon, or better known as Abe Cohan, is buried at Edgewood Cemetery in Edgewood, Ohio. On January 24, 1909, Maria Paulina Forschner, nicknamed Mary, a 15-year-old employee of the Kling Tobacco Warehouse, described as unusually pretty for her age, left the home of her merchant stepfather Robert Geppert in North Dayton. Mary had been on an errand to deposit $9 in the bank. It was Saturday evening, and she left home around 6:15. Her parents expected her to return by 8:30. Robert Geppert was Mary's stepfather, the head of a large blended household of 11 kids, 5 his and 4 his wife's. Plus they had 2 together, so you can imagine the house was a beehive of activity, and it was sometimes a challenge to keep track of the kids. Geppert worked as a meat cutter at Christopher C. Summerlot's grocery and butcher shop at 600 Kiowa Street, which is North Kiowa Street today. Robert left Summerlot's grocery, where he had been working all day, sometime between 8:30 and 8:45. He went to Corman's barber shop at Kiowa Street and the railroad. Robert left the barber shop around 9:30 and then stopped at Hackworth Saloon on the corner of Earl and Kiowa Street. It was not quite 10 o'clock when Robert had arrived home. The Gepperts thought Mary would be home already. Robert's wife told him that Mary was out, that she had not yet come home, and they decided she had gone with her sister Maggie to a dance downtown, so he went to bed. It was after 12 a.m. when Maggie and her company got home, and when Robert found Mary was not with her, he got out of bed and went out to look for her. Robert walked down to the car. He saw the light on the corner at the turn and thought there would be another car. No more cars came, and he went back to the house. Geppert got himself a lantern and organized a search party with neighbors Arthur Heyer and John Merkel without notifying authorities till midnight. Lieutenant Haley dispatched officers to aid in the search, but before they arrived, Robert Geppert noticed some disturbed soil which led to a trail. It ended in the estate of Grafton C. Kennedy, where, with the aid of his lantern, Geppert found Mary's lifeless body. The coroner concluded that she had been assaulted, and after having been struck repeatedly upon the head with a club or blunt instrument of some kind, Mary was choked into unconsciousness. The motive was not robbery. Mary Forschner's bank deposit book was found nearby, the $9 still in it. She likely dropped it when she tried to fight off her attacker. If the killer had known what was in it, He might have stopped to take the money after committing the crime, but his goal was far sicker. The $9 Mary had on her in 1909 would be the equivalent of $305 today. Two people claimed to have seen the assailant, Sam Morris and Mrs. John Sheff. Morris said that he had heard cries at about 6:30 p.m. and looked outside, observing a man sitting on a fence and glancing at a dark spot in the fields. He tried to approach the mysterious stranger, who threatened to shoot him. Sam went back in the house to retrieve his shotgun, and he fired off 2 warning shots into the air. By the time Morris returned, the man had vanished. Mrs. Sheff claimed that she had just gotten off a train car near the same spot when a man appeared out of the darkness. She began running towards her home, with him following suit, but the man ceased after she entered her home. In the meantime, another woman, Mrs. Powers, was attacked, but thankfully saved by her husband James. The perpetrator escaped, but left his victim with nearly all clothes torn and her throat bruised. A postmortem held later for Mary developed the fact that the girl had been assaulted. After having been struck repeatedly upon the head with a club or blunt instrument of some kind and choked into unconsciousness, the coroner, upon performing the autopsy, established that the killer had abnormally large hands, as his finger imprints extended far around the victim's neck. For days later, a Pennsylvania Railroad detective reported that a man matching the description was observed getting off a Dayton train car at Springfield. The suspect was a black man, with a roughly bandaged hand, scratched face, and wore corduroy trousers, the same type of clothing that the supposed killer had worn. The suspicious man was never located. Charles Snyder, a factory worker and boarder of the Geppert home. Snyder was one of 3 persons taken into custody shortly after Mary Forschner's murder. He was first brought up by Barbara Leokunkel, who accused Snyder of entering into his shop in a panicked state, washing off mud and blood from his clothes before abruptly leaving. According to him, this occurred only half an hour after Forschner's murder. Little credit was given to his statements, and Snyder was proven innocent of the crime shortly after. Samuel Morris was held as a suspect initially but later cleared. His role in the events of January 24, 1909 is now considered that of an eyewitness who was likely present during and within a few dozen feet of the assault and murder of Mary Forschner as it occurred. Morris estimated the time to be approximately 9:20 p.m. It's been 114 years since Mary Forschner's death. The family home is no longer there as the area was repurposed for Interstate 75. Interstate 75 goes directly over where Mary's body had been found all those years ago. Her killer was never found and convicted. The similarities of her murder is of the same nature as Adah, Dona, Anna, and Abe, so officials say it has to be the work of the Dayton Strangler. Elizabeth Lizzie Fulhart was only 18 years old but had been commuting from her home in Vandalia to Dayton on a regular basis. Some say her travels were to see her boyfriend, others say it was for employment. However, on January 29, 1909, Lizzie, as she was known by acquaintances, went missing. Nobody heard from her for several days. Then, on February 5, 1909, a development. The discovery today was made by Charles Weaver and his father, Fred Weaver, who had gone to a house at 124 North Jefferson Street to do some carpentering. The house has been vacant for some time, and the two men were sent to put it in shape for occupancy. After lunch, Charles Weaver was thirsty. Charles Weaver, on the way back to his work about 2 o'clock, went to the cistern to get a drink of water. The lid on the cistern refused to yield to hand pressure, and the young man got a crowbar and pried it off. As Weaver stooped to reach into the cistern with his water bucket, he noticed a bundle of clothing floating on top of the water, which was fringed with dirt and debris of varied description. He took hold of the clothes and pulled. The clothes were heavy, and when he had tugged for some time, a pair of human feet emerged from the water. Weaver dropped his hold upon the clothing and called his father. The two men tried to drag the body from the cistern, but the water was so far from the mouth that they were compelled to fish out the bundle with a hoe. There are some inaccuracies with Elizabeth's case. According to a number of sources in the Wikipedia entry for the Dayton Strangler, Elizabeth Fulhart's date of death is listed as sometime after February 7th. In truth, Lizzie had been missing since January 29, 1909, and her body was discovered in the cistern February 5th and reported in the papers on the 6th. The coroner estimated her body had been in the cistern about a week. That fixes Elizabeth Fulhart's approximate date of death as January 29, 1909, or perhaps the day after, within 24 hours of arriving in Dayton. That would also mean Elizabeth Fulhart's death took place only about 5 days after the death of Mary Forschner. There are a number of elements of the Elizabeth Fulhart death that can make one question whether it is actually the work of the Dayton Strangler. The body was found wrapped in burlap and carefully hidden in a manner inconsistent with the careless way previous victims were discarded. It is, however, hard to deny a young female victim killed in Dayton in 1909 could be a victim of the Dayton Strangler. Especially when the vacant house where Lizzie Fulhart's body was found was right in between the sites of the Lance, Gilman, Markowitz, Cohan murders and the Mary Forner murder. Just 3 blocks from City Hall and in a part of Dayton described at the time as densely settled. Oh, and you could catch a streetcar just a couple blocks away. Initially, authorities experienced difficulty in determining the cause of death due to the notable lack of choking fractures on the neck, unlike the previous victims. Several theories were advanced, including suicide, poisoning, or that the bag was tied around her head and she was thrown while still alive. The murder shocked the denizens of Dayton, and church attendance among women dropped significantly. At night, almost no female was left unescorted. Following Fulhart's death, the killing ceased. Frank Smith, known by the alias J.E. Smith, was arrested alongside Cooley and Wilkie. Smith was at the time charged with attacking a girl on January 8th in Dayton's East End. His victim later identified him. Authorities suspected him of killing Fulhart solely based on his other crime, but had no conclusive proof, and later released him along with the others. Roy Cooley, a Mulder and close friend of Fulhart, Cooley was detained by authorities for examination. However, no evidence was found, and he was later released. Albert Wilkie, reputed to be Fulhart's fiancé, Wilkie was arrested alongside Cooley and Smith. Although detained for a bit longer than the former, he was later released due to lack of evidence as well. On April 25, 1909, Elmer Carr was accused by his former employer Mrs. Middlestetter of being responsible for arsons, pickpockets, and the murder of 3 women, 2 in Dayton and 1 in Boston, New York. One of the 2 Dayton murders was indeed that of Elizabeth Fulhart, reinforced by the fact that the pair were seen together on January 29th. However, a few days later, Middlestetter made another statement which ironically exonerated Carr, at least concerning Fulhart's killing. It's been 115 years since Elizabeth Lizzie Fulhart's death. No person was ever charged and convicted for her death. Elizabeth is sadly buried in an unmarked grave that her father had purchased in 1909, next to a tree at Poplar Hill Cemetery in Vandalia, Ohio. Hopefully one day a marker can be placed upon Elizabeth's grave in her memory so she is not forgotten about. A big thank you to Administrative Assistant Christine with the City of Vandalia for helping locate Elizabeth's grave. The world was a different place in the 1900s. Very few homes had a phone, and just as few had electricity. There was something like one phone for every 20 people at the time. Communication with the authorities was slow, and so was the response. Cars were still a rarity, and city dwellers used the train to get around. Steam, diesel, and electric streetcars, sometimes called traction cars. Outhouses and water closets were still a thing, and nighttime travel was dangerous for a woman alone, especially in wild public spaces that were hard to light. There just wasn't the technology and forensics we have today. Fingerprints and DNA wasn't widely used in investigations. Brian Forschner is the great-nephew of Mary Forner and has a background in criminal justice. Brian published a book called Cold Serial: The Jack the Strangler Murders, detailing the Dayton Strangler murders. Brian is convinced a man by the name of Hick White is responsible for all, if not most, of these horrific crimes. The string of crimes against girls and young women in Dayton ended with the incarceration of Hick White, the janitor at B'nai Yeshurun Synagogue, now known as Temple Israel. White had lured 25-year-old Bessie Stickford of Springfield to B'nai Yeshurun on February 2, 1910, with the promise of a job interview. He held her at knife point in the rabbi's study. Exactly a year before, Lizzie Fulhart's corpse had been found in a cistern in an alley behind the synagogue. Bessie survived White's assault and identified him. White was convicted and imprisoned, only for Bessie's case. In composite, government, media, private detectives, and even neighbors seemed more motivated by pride, greed, politics, one-upmanship, and grandstanding than the pursuit of anything close to justice. It's been well over 100 years since Adah, Dona, Anna, Abraham, Mary, and Elizabeth were taken from us much too soon. Their story was not over yet, and they had so much life to live. Sadly, the identity of the Dayton Strangler may never be officially known. May this video live on so these 6 victims will always be remembered and never be forgotten. May Adah Lance, Dona Gilman, Anna Markowitz, Abraham Cohan, Mary Forner, and Elizabeth Fulhart all rest in peace, and their life and story never be forgotten. In loving memory. Please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Everything But Interesting, and go check out my other videos. Thank you.